All right, folks, the time has come. 10:15, right on the mark. Glad to see you here today. Looking forward to this session with you, continuing on this theme of storm stories. So let's pray together. Lord, I pray that you would open up our ears, our hearts, our minds, the core of who we are as human beings, so that we might receive into you more and more of your gracious presence. And I ask it in Christ's name. Amen. You know, just during communion service this morning, the choir was singing, no, I can't remember what the song was. It was from, have you ever seen the movie Places in the Heart? It's one of my favorite all-time movies. And when we were going forward for communion, the choir was singing that. And I'll tell you what, brought tears to my eyes. You'd have to see the movie, which was a long time ago, but it concludes with a very surprising, kind of stunning communion scene after all sorts of chaos going on in a bunch of people's lives. It's really a beautiful thing. And it just reminds me, I think, I was thinking about this a lot in worship this morning. You know what this is? You know what you are, what I am? We're sort of reminders to the world that there's more. You know, there's just more than what you and I can see and think and feel. In fact, I'm very convinced that there is really a vast inner world in every single one of us. And the whole purpose of our life together, especially in the church, is to begin to enter into, it's like, C.S. Lewis's wardrobe. It's to go through the doors of the wardrobe into this inner world, which is extraordinary. It's the place where life happens. I think about this when I dream. I think I've mentioned one of my dream stories a couple of weeks ago about raccoons. Terry said, you better not ever mention that again. So I won't mention the raccoons, but I did have a dream about them in the lake. I better quit, okay? Why did I have a weird dream like that? I mean, what is it inside of us that is so vast and so creative and so meaningful that we hear a piece of music and tears come to our eyes, that we have a dream in the night about something we could never have put together in our brains in the meantime? I mean, somewhere in all of that is the world of the Spirit, and that's what we're trying to experience here. All right, storm stories. There are two of them that involve Jesus. Context is important for these two storm stories. Now, when Jesus, I've got to get my clicker here. Now, when Jesus saw the great crowds around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. So keep in mind, this at the very moment when Jesus' fame was rising, he decides to disconnect from it. And why? Why would he want to do that? I think it's because there were 2 points of focus in Jesus' ministry, and I think he sensed that the one was overwhelming the other. We get the feel for this in Jesus' own words. To set the context for that, we're told this is really right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry as it's recorded in Luke. It says, Jesus came to Nazareth, the town where he had grown up. And as was his custom on the Sabbath, I love that little phrase, as was his custom on the Sabbath. Jesus went to Sabbath synagogue worship. I mean, my mind started to go off on this a little bit, and I thought, well, what if you were to walk in that room back there right now and come just sit down here in the first row or something, look up at me? Well, Jesus was in the synagogue for worship. And there was handed to him, the passage goes on to say, there was handed to him the book of the prophet Isaiah, and Jesus found the place where it is written, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captive, recovery of sight to the blind, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. If you look at that and take it apart little piece by piece, you'll see there are 2 main points of ministry for Jesus. The first is a healing ministry, and the second is a teaching and disciple-making ministry. And I think the thing that Jesus was a little bit concerned about was that his healing ministry was crowding out his teaching ministry. Dale Bruner puts it this way, great Bible scholar. Dale says, Jesus knew he had to do something deeper than heal people. He had to make disciples. Real disciples are the world's, I like this little phrase, real disciples are the world's healthiest reality and evil's major antibodies. Real Christian people are the stem cells that the world needs most. So when Jesus leaves the healing ministry for the teaching one, he's not leaving the physical. He's reaching beneath it to its sources. Like I was saying a few minutes ago, there is a vastness to your inner world, and Jesus is reaching into that. All right, so when Jesus says you are the salt of the earth, he's kind of touching on that. You're the light of the world. What a wonderful God we have. Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who so wonderfully comforts and helps us in all of our hardships and trials. And why does he do that? So that when others are troubled, we can pass on to them the same help and comfort that God has given to us. That's the disciple-making ministry. Terry and I got an email the other day from Chico. The house where we live is in Liberty County. Chico is the energy provider, electricity provider. Sam Houston Electric Company, Chico. They called us and they said, or they emailed us and said, power's going to be off tomorrow morning for 4 or 5 hours while we do some maintenance work. And it's just such an inconvenience when the power goes out. You know what I mean? So we started planning ahead. What do we got to do to get ready for the power to be out? At least we had warning. I knew I had to make a trip into Houston. So I thought, well, I got to get the car out of the garage because, no power, you can't get the garage door to open. Took the car out of the garage. She took care of the coffee. And we have a little quirky thing with our washer and dryer. If the power goes off in the middle of a cycle, it messes them up. Anyway, whole bunch of little arrangements we were making about that. When suddenly it occurred to us, wait a minute. Didn't we just install a Generac whole house power system? That is prevention. That's not treatment. I mean, you could think of it in terms of vaccination. We know a lot about vaccinations after what we've been through the last couple of years, but I'm like many of you, I'm a child of the polio generation. You remember that? Many of us were. I think about what that must have been like for our parents before they came up with the vaccine. What a terror it was, because what a terrible disease it was. And so, like some of you, I remember getting the sugar cube. And then I remember getting the booster shot later on. And so, you think about that. Which is better? Like 2 seconds to get a shot in your arm, prevention, or a whole lifetime of managing the difficulty. So Jesus is trying to bring preventative things into the world through his teaching, disciple-making ministry. And Jesus could have stayed there. I mean, the passage tells us that huge crowds of people were coming after him. He could have stayed there in that place, and he would never have run out of business. I mean, sadly, there's no end to hurting and broken people in the world. The line was always going to be long for Jesus doing his healing ministry, but he knew that if he did that, he would never get to the disciple-making ministry. He would always be dealing with treatment rather than with prevention. So, see if I can get this right. I got my slides out of order a little bit. Just before he could leave the area and get into a boat, a scribe approached him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." So Jesus is approached before he gets into the boat to disconnect from the crowd. He's approached by a man who has a different kind of problem. His is an intellectual problem. We know that because he's a scribe. This is the first time that Jesus' ministry to a scribe is mentioned in Matthew's gospel. The scribes were the intellectual theologians of Jesus' day. Their whole background, their whole history was a combination, like getting degrees as in law and theology and the humanities. These were among the most respected people in Judaism. They were the repository of Israel's tremendous intellectual history. For these people, knowledge brought with it power and security. you can almost hear this scribe saying, "At last, I found someone I can respect, someone whose intellect is satisfying and challenging to a trained mind like mine." You know, it's hard for really intelligent people to find similarly intelligent people. I know nothing about that personally, frankly, just not me. I'm the most average IQ. In fact, I'm really not very smart. That's why God has given me, I think, a certain interest in telling stories, because I can't think my way through things. I can't make connections until I find some illustration of it. So when you see me telling stories, it's not a little tool that I'm using. It's actually the way my brain works. All right, so the man comes to Jesus, and you get the feeling that it's almost like he wants to get a handle on Jesus. He's become a major admirer of Jesus, and he wants to master Jesus' system. So he addresses him as teacher. He's one of the few people who addresses Jesus in this way. He doesn't say to him, Lord, he says teacher. And he doesn't ask him if he can follow. He announces that he's going to follow. And so Jesus offers him this response. Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Now, I don't really know what this man was hoping for in Jesus' response. He might have been thinking, now total speculation on my part, might have been thinking Jesus would say to him, oh, that is awesome. We don't have any scribes in our little community. That would fill a very important category. Have you ever been on a nonprofit board? You ever tried to put a nonprofit board together? I was in nonprofit work for 50 years. I finally retired a couple of years ago from all nonprofits. But one of the great challenges was building a good board. You got to get the right people in the right places. And I can imagine that this scribe may have thought that he would make a great addition to the little community of disciples who were following Jesus. Now, theologians and teachers have been debating what Jesus meant by this little riddle for 2,000 years, and have come up with a number of explanations. There doesn't seem to be any front runner, so if that's the case, then I feel completely comfortable in just telling you my opinion. But it is just my opinion. What's he trying to say? I'm wondering if maybe when Jesus said foxes, that's an animal that produces a certain image in the mind. You think of a person who is sly as a fox. You think of a woman who is foxy. You think of, just the kind of people who live out on the edge of mischief and everything else. And Jesus is saying to him, foxes, people of that mindset, they found a way to be at home in the world. I think that's what he means by saying they live in holes. They've got their place. On the other hand, what about birds? Well, birds are sort of the opposite of the foxes in the Bible, at least. Birds are, think of doves, peace. Think of robins and sparrows, the attentiveness that God gives to them. So you've got the whole spectrum, if I'm thinking of this correctly, of the sorts of people in the world. And he's saying that birds also have found a way to make themselves at home in this world. They have a nest. Foxes have holes. Birds of the air have nests. Okay. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. One thing I think Jesus is trying to say to this man of intellect, I think he's saying, my system is not like you expect. It's not about finding a way to be at home in this world. You're never really going to get a handle on it. Jesus' way is the upside down way. It's the weakness that comes, a strength that comes through weakness. It's finding your life by losing your life. It's getting rich by giving away. It's all those things that are sort of upside down, at least in the eyes of the world. Life is not a matter of winning, but of losing. Remember what Paul said, have the same mind in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself. Being born in human likeness and being found in human likeness, he became obedient to death through the cross. You see, that's downward mobility. Very different, I think, from the orientation that this Pharisee would have had, or this scribe would have had. This is a world where the ultimate example of success and power is a man on a cross. Jesus is not anti-intellectual. It's just that the intellect is not the primary tool. The heart is the primary tool. Because the whole centerpiece of life is relationships. And the only way you make relationships work in the end is through love. As Cynthia Borgel puts it, trying to find God with the intellectual center is something like trying to play a violin with a saw. It's simply the wrong tool for the job. So, I actually think Jesus is pretty sympathetic to this man and his deep intellectual curiosity. I don't think Jesus is being sarcastic or difficult. I'm not an intellectual. Like I said a few minutes ago, I'm not the bright guy. But I do have a lot of questions. I mean, you can't go very far into this Christian life without getting a whole lot of questions. I think Jesus was simply meeting this man where he was, in his head, in his intellect. I think he intentionally wove out this intriguing riddle for him to get him think. I think Jesus is actually honoring his mind, his quest for intellectual understanding, by giving him this riddle. He's going to think about this for a long time. What did he mean by the birds? What did he mean by the foxes? I mean, I gave you my impression. I go read the commentaries. You'll see all sorts of other things. And this is 2,000 years later. We still haven't figured it out. I think Jesus is honoring this man's mind. All right. Just then, he was approached by another man. I don't know what's going on here. There. Another of his disciples came to him and said, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Now it says here, this man's already a disciple, so he's sort of on board with a lot of what Jesus is talking about. He refers to him as Lord. He's been following Jesus for a while. And what he's seen thus far has made him hungry for more. But first. Now, at first it sounds like a pretty noble thing. I need to go bury my father, but there's no sense in the passage that his father was even ill. I mean, the general thinking is basically what he was saying was, I'm all yours, Jesus, 100% in over my head with you as long as I take care of my other obligations. You know, I think this but first discipleship is pretty common. I don't know, around our house, Terry takes care of earth, and I take care of heaven. I mean, her office is downstairs. My office is upstairs. I mean, even this morning in worship, offering plate comes by, she reaches into her purse, grabs a check, gives it to me, so I can look like I'm the man in charge, putting it in. I don't know. We found a way that works for us, but it's really a good thing that she takes care of earth, because if it wasn't for that, I'd be homeless or in prison, one or the other. Somebody's got to do earth, you know? Reality is life is full of earth. We've all got our but first, you know, the earth things we've got to take care of. Sometimes we've got to figure those things into our daily discipleship. I mean, even Jesus, you know, had to eat. He had to clip his nails. He had to, you know, keep up with decent sandals, had to do his laundry. I mean, when his stepfather died, as the first son in the family, he had responsibility to look after his mother, Mary's, needs at some point. All right, just to be clear about this. This would have been better if the Astros hadn't been playing baseball yesterday. In fact, Terry can attest to this. I came downstairs at 4:07, and I came down with this iPad and a piece of paper, like I was going to do some work on this while I was watching that. But these are the Astros, and it just doesn't happen that often. It's Earth, okay? There are some Earth things that really matter a lot to us. And I think what Jesus is saying to this man is, and I actually think he's being thoughtful, and we can't hear the tone of his voice, but I think it was probably this way. I think he was being very sympathetic. I think he was reminding the man, while you're taking care of earth, don't forget heaven. So we begin making our earthly decisions through a heavenly filter. We need to take the things of the earth within a spiritual context. Something like that came home to me over the last couple of weeks. There's a tree and a door. First of all, the door. It's a bedroom door. It goes into our master bedroom. We've lived in this house now 9 years, and just recently, in opening and closing the door, it started to brush the floor, and that always makes me nervous. Living in Houston with the weird soil we've got around here, and with this epic drought that's going on right now, I'm thinking, oh boy, something's going on. Of course, the only problem with that is our house is built on piers and not on a slab. So I'm very intrigued about this, confused about it, and I sure didn't want to start wrecking the door. So I tried a couple of things, tried watering underneath the house and this and that. Nothing seemed to work. So I came up with a plan. I'm going to take it off of its hinges and I'm going to shave it down and then I'll put it all back together again. I got this thing all worked out, got all the tools and everything else. Then our son, Grant, came here from Nashville. And he's just so good at all these things. So I said to him, hey, Grant, will you help me? I got to take this door off the hinges. We'll take it outside. We'll shave it off. We'll put it back on. Because it's just starting to scrape on the bedroom floor. He stood back from the door and he said, Dad, it's just crooked. He said, do you have a pry bar? Yeah. Went out in the garage and found it. And he took a cloth and put it underneath one end of the pry bar. And then he just put his weight down. You should see my son, Grant. He's just massive. I mean that in a positive way. He works out 7 days a week. He's just all muscles. He's 6'3", and oh my gosh. So when I started hearing the floor or something going crack, 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 and did that for maybe 30 seconds, and then took out the pry bar, took the little piece of cloth away, open and close the door. No, it's scraping. He said sometimes they just sag on their hinges. I'm sure glad I talked to Grant about this before I took the door off the hinges and took it out in the backyard, shaved it down, and came up with who knows what kind of disaster. Oh, then there's the tree on the other side. A while back, one of our trees died. It was a pretty young tree. There wasn't that much to it. When I went out to cut it up in little pieces, I noticed these little holes all over it, and that got my attention. I thought, oh boy, some kind of an infestation of beetles. So I look at some of the other trees in the yard. A lot of them have those same holes. So I'm thinking, oh my God, there's only one thing you can do. You got to cut them all down, burn them before they have a chance to, infest the whole rest of your yard and the neighbors too. So while I'm warming up the chainsaw, our neighbor, John Goronsky, comes over. He's a master gardener. He looked at it and he said, I don't think those are beetles. He said, that looks like a woodpecker. And so I did a little research on it, and sure enough, yellow-bellied sapsuckers. You can tell because they drill their holes in little horizontal lines, one right after the other. I'm sure glad I had a conversation with my friend John Goronsky before I cut down all the trees in my yard. I think Jesus understands that our life contains a lot of earth. I think Jesus understood the complications that this man was saying when we talked about his father and burying him. I think what Jesus is saying, though, is make sure your basic orientation toward heaven, even when you're buried by earth, is to be heavenly. Somehow got to bring those two together. By the way, last night watching this baseball game, I think way back to when I started watching things, athletic events. Fast forward to today and all the angles and cameras and everything else. I mean, you can see everything that happens. See the rotation of the ball as it comes. Anyway, it's just fascinating. So there was 2 points in the game. The first one was when a guy was, for the Yankees. I just love beating the Yankees. I mean that in a very Christian sort of way, but I just love beating the Yankees. Anyway, one of the players got kind of too far off first base, and the throw came from the pitcher to first base. He had to dive back in, and then he did this strange thing after he had made it back safely. Called timeout, got up, and he reached down and he started brushing the dirt away from the edge of first base, so that you could see they have little cameras inside the base, so that you can see right at ground level. And he was cleaning it away, cleaning the dirt away so something could be seen. I think I don't know. Does that make any kind of sense to you at all? Sometimes you just have to clear the earth away so you can see a little better what you're dealing with in heaven. One of the reasons why you're here, I think. All right. So, Jesus doesn't offer the first man the intellectual security that he hopes for. And Jesus doesn't offer the second man kind of the freedom to pick and choose how to manage his life. So what does Jesus give? That's all prologue. And I think it fits to what comes next. What does Jesus offer? Well, after this, he got into a boat with his disciples. They followed him. It was time to move from the emergency room to the classroom. Now, in the Hebrew world, Hebrews were not water dwelling people. The sea was a terror for them, and their primary experience with water was on the Sea of Galilee, Lake Galilee, which had a reputation for coming up with sudden storms. Jesus goes out there in his boat. I like that picture. It's like, as I understand it, that's the Sea of Galilee in the background. It would have been a classic boat in Jesus' day. Now, it's not tiny, but it has its limits when the storm comes. Now, oddly enough, Jesus, who has just said, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Despite having just said that, Jesus put his head down in the back of the boat and went to sleep. Now, the scale of the storm, if you look at the original languages, was seismic. I mean, the words that are used are the words that you would use to describe an earthquake. This was an earthquake of a storm. And as they were about to discover, the only thing they had going for them at that point was that they were with Jesus. So a gale arose on the lake so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. And they went and they woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." Now, if you follow the verses and the words closely, you'll notice that stilling the storm is not the first thing that Jesus does. He just lets the storm go on. And he wants to have a chat with them about their faith. I can sort of picture him saying, "Yo, Jesus, can we talk about this later? This boat is sinking." Why are you afraid? Can't you see that I'm in the boat with you? Why are you afraid? Why are you afraid of the things that frighten you? What are your fears? Our daughter and son-in-law and their two kids have been with us this last weekend at our house, at our lake house, our only house. And it turns out that Luke, how old was Luke? Maybe 7? Something like that. I don't know where these things come from, but he can only manage to sleep in a bed that has one side of it hard up against a wall because he's worried about what's underneath the bed. And he can manage it if the bed is up against the wall. If the bed is up against the wall, he only has to worry about what might come from that end. And he's got these stuffed animals along this side they're like gargoyles, that probably could keep whatever was under the bed from coming out. I mean, it sounds crazy, but honestly, sometimes if I'm in bed and I'm trying to cool myself off a little, I'll hang my leg over the side of the bed just to cool off. That still makes me nervous to do that. I don't know what's down there. Really? I mean, well, do you? So we all have these fears. Now, note that Jesus often healed suffering people immediately when they asked. He didn't say come back, office hours are 9 to 5. No, he just did it then. And even if they were, 500 miles away from home, he'd say, it's done. He'd do long distance healings and all the rest of that. But in this case, when the disciples are terrified by a storm, he doesn't calm the storm, at least not right away. Discipleship is mostly on the job training, and some things can only be learned in the storm. So Jesus lets the wind blow on. But with that thing in mind that I said a few minutes ago, why are you afraid? I'm in the boat with you. So Jesus is taking his disciples into some new territory, and a lot of it's going to have to do with fear management. Some things you can only learn in a storm. But here's something that's important to keep in mind. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is just sit quietly in the storm. Sometimes our efforts to quiet things down can make things worse. Sometimes, remember, Jesus is in the boat with you. So Jesus speaks of their fear and their little faith. The opposite of faith is not doubt, it's fear. Now, I'm going to leave out this next part. I mean, you don't even know what it is, so you're not going to feel like, oh man, I wish you'd said that. That would have been the best part of the whole day. It's just, I have to get this stuff in like Wednesday, and a lot of stuff comes to my mind later than that. So I'm going to skip through this next part on faith and fear, even though it's just incredible material. Rick Rescorla, you know him. Not been given a spirit of fear, but a power, love, and self-discipline. Yeah, that's rich stuff. Well, eventually Jesus does offer them relief. He calms the sea, but not before he taught them all they needed to know. You think back, fast forward now with all these disciples, every single one of them except one, just John. They died a violent death for their faith. And I can just imagine that when they were going to their various death, stoning, crucifixion, whippings, etc., they may have had this moment in mind when they were on the boat in the storm with Jesus. And yet somehow in the middle of the storm, there was peace. Peter was crucified upside down. He didn't consider it to be worthy to be crucified right side up like Jesus. Well, then Jesus got up, rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a dead calm. They were amazed, saying, "What sort of man is this that even the winds and the seas obey him?" What sort of man is this? You know, who likes a storm? But really, the only way you can discover really who Jesus is, his astonishing power, is to be in a storm with him. On the job training. All right, so now there's another storm story involving Jesus. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake. A little context on this one too. Jesus has just fed the multitude on the hillside, 5,000 people. And the 5,000 people were so overwhelmed by this that they wanted to come and make Jesus king. And that was not in Jesus' game plan. So he went and hid in the mountains, and that evening his disciples went out and got in a boat to go across the lake, and Jesus was not with them. Okay. When Jesus came, when evening came, disciples went down to the lake, got into a boat, and started across the lake to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The lake became rough because a strong wind was blowing. I don't know, that always strikes me as the perfect description of life without Jesus in the boat. It's dark, it's rough, and the wind is blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, by the way, this slide doesn't do justice to this piece of art that I found online. But you get the general idea, don't you? Jesus comes illuminated across the water. When they rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the lake and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. I love that picture of Jesus personifying light. You know, I see you because light is being reflected off of you. You see me in the same way. But only Jesus actually glows in the dark. He is light. So here comes light. You can appreciate, I think this picture gives me a certain appreciation for why the disciples were a little bit astonished and frightened by this. You know, whether you're in a storm or calm water, whether you've got intellectual questions or your earthly weights are mounting up, when you invite Jesus into your boat, you arrive at your destination. That's what this passage says. They wanted him to get in the boat, and when he got into the boat, immediately they arrived at their destination. The destination that we long for in our lives is to have Jesus in our boat. And earth is always threatening to overtake this. We all have questions. You know, for the last 9 years, I have been very blessed to work for the Robert and Janice McNair Foundation. And one of the things that I have done a lot over the years is I will go to this NRG stadium during football season, and I'll, like one day a week, I'll go there and I'll pray through the stadium, through the rafters and all the way down onto the playing field. And to be honest with you, after a while, I have absolutely no idea what I'm praying for. Really? Am I praying that the Texans will win? Do I pray that the Raiders will lose this afternoon? I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's about something bigger than that. And I think about all the 70,000 people who are going to be sitting in those seats. What are their interests? What are they thinking about? What are their burdens? What is their religious persuasion? Lord, why am I supposed to pray? I don't get this. And it occurred to me just like a lightning bolt a few years ago. I don't pray. I don't do this because it makes sense. I do it because it works. I think the general sway of life with Jesus, oftentimes it doesn't make sense, but we carry on faithfully because we discover this works. Generally it works. The Texans haven't really done all that well since I've been praying for them. All right. So Jesus takes us out into his boat and reveals to us his glory and power. Maybe some of you have seen this. This is the Jesus boat. It's during a time, I think it was 1989, something like that, a time of a drought and historically low water levels on the Sea of Galilee. The top edges of what appeared to be a boat began to appear in the mud, and they started excavating it. And they did, carbon testing on it. And they discovered that the evidence would seem to be that this boat was from the first century. And the place where it was found is not that far from Jesus' home base for ministry in Capernaum. And so people began to wonder, could this be the boat that Jesus and the disciples were in? So they dug this thing up, and it took 2 weeks of round-the-clock labor to get it out. And they had to be extremely careful with it, because as soon as it came out of the water and started to dry out, the wood would just fall apart. So they had to encase it in, I think it was styrofoam or something like that. And then they put it in a place, and it sat there for 12 years, something like that, while they're trying to figure out more and more how to preserve it. And then when they figured out that they could preserve it and they got all the mud off of it, they thought, well, people are going to want to see this. So they built this huge information center. I don't know how many $1 million they spent on that. And this is the centerpiece of it. Why would people go to so much trouble and so much expense just to preserve a boat that maybe Jesus sat on? Well, that would be something. It would be something to be in the boat with Jesus. I think Jesus is saying to us, whether you're perplexed with doubts, anxieties, or overwhelmed by earth in your life right now, I think Jesus wants to say, why are you afraid? Can't you see? I'm in the boat with you. You know this prayer? The Breton fisherman's prayer. So short and simple. Oh God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small. And this bug, earth. Please pray with me. Lord, I am grateful for your presence in all of the little watercraft that we find ourselves floating in. Each one of us here today, I am confident, is facing questions about you or feeling the burden of earthly responsibilities. The most significant thing we can do anytime and always is to say, Lord, please be in the boat with me. And when we do that, I can't explain how, we will discover you're in it with us. And nothing will ever be the same. Who is this man that even the winds and the waves obey him? Amen. We will see you next week for the 4th storm story.